Welcome to Attributions. Today we're speaking with Gaia Zanaboni about climate change's impacts on women for International Women's Day. Gaia works for Women Engaged for a Common Future, a non-profit organisation, with her focus on the connections between international climate policy and its connection and impacts on women and girls. We speak about many topics, including why women feel climate change's impacts more than men, how climate change policy affects women, the current challenges to more female engagement in international negotiations like the COP climate conferences, and how the perspectives of women can influence climate change solutions for the better. It was great to have Gaia on Attributions, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, so we are here with Gaia Zanaboni. Gaia, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you, and I'm very excited to be talking about the connection between gender and climate. It's very understudied, unfortunately.
So, Gaia, before we do get started on talking all things climate and gender, I was just wondering if you could perhaps give us a background on who you are and where you're working, for example.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, so my name is Gaia Zanaboni. I'm originally from Italy, but I moved to the Netherlands to start working for WECF, which is spelled out Women Engaged for a Common Future. And it's an international nonprofit that works on ecofeminist projects. So indeed, we work on the specific nexus between gender and climate, but we also have some areas of focus, and mine is more international climate policy making and the connections with gender. And right now I'm also studying degrowth. So also in my work, I try to bring a degrowth perspective to our projects and to the things we do. And I'm really interested in queer ecology as well.
Let's first talk about the term disproportionately affects women. Now, this term, in the context of climate change, of course, now this term does get used. It's getting more and more used lately. A lot more people are bringing this term to attention. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that particular term, but also how big is the difference here on climate change's impacts on women compared to, say, men in, this can be any scenario, like maybe a natural disaster scenario, for example. What's your take on this?
No, thanks for the question. I think it's a very much needed one, because these days, especially in the policymaking world, we always hear this word disproportionately, but I don't find it so accessible at times, because in the end, what does it mean that women and girls are more disproportionately affected? So, yeah, I mean, of course, I do think there is a huge difference between how women and girls, but also gender diverse people are hit by the climate crisis in comparison to men. And only this could take a 1-hour podcast episode, I think. But I'm just going to focus on the most major differences. In general, when it even comes to poverty, it's women and girls that compose most of the world's poor. So that, of course, has an obvious effect when it comes to the climate crisis, and people have to migrate, but they don't have the resources to do so. And in that way, their health then also gets impacted. And also women and girls, especially in the global south, tend to rely more on natural resources because they engage more in informal ways of working and in carrying work responsibilities, which also in the case of a disaster makes it so that they don't have the possibility to move, also because of the economic status, but also because they have to indeed focus on their career responsibilities, which a lot of the times men don't have. And also there is still the issue of land ownership rights, because in a lot of countries, a lot of women and girls can still not own land, and they have to ask permission from their husband. And this also makes it also makes it very hard for them to like survive during a catastrophe because they can't really rely on their own territory, of course. And also for toxicity and deforestation, also in that case, it disproportionately impacts women and diverse people from a health perspective because there is just overall less awareness when it comes to women's bodies, and especially all the toxins that nowadays we're consuming on a daily basis and the effect on the reproductive system, even though this is also showing to be a problem for men these days. And also, of course, now with global warming, climate refugees are increasing more and more, and it's estimated that there might be up to 2 million by 2050. And I was looking at the numbers yesterday, and others saying that 80% of these are women, indeed, which is, of course, a huge number difference, and it's because of all the other things that I highlighted. But at the same time, we do have a problem that we lack a lot of times gender disaggregated data, which means just scientific data that looks at different genders. Because most of the time when scientists do some kind of climate research, they don't really look at the distinctions between men and women, and not to mention other genders or like queer people. And this also makes it a problem sometimes to specific to look specific into the reasons why women are impacted so much more than men. But indeed, I hope that I could shed some light over these words. But of course, it's a very big topic.
It's a big topic, and like you said, you could sit here and unpack, several of those things in greater detail. I think you mentioned gender disaggregated data, and I just wanted to clarify for listeners that by that you mean when, say, a scientist does a study, they basically just pile in data without actually identifying the specifics of the person getting impacted, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's the problem, that they create a general database where they don't specify who the data refers to and if there are major differences between gender. So this is always something that we try to ask for in the policy spaces, that they include and start demanding more gender disaggregated data.
Do you think, now you did mention like things like climate migration and things like that, do you think that with, in particular, the way the world is going right now, we are obviously not seeing a decrease in warming temperatures, for example. Can you see this situation intensifying in terms of impacts on women, especially when it comes to things like water security and food security? Those things kind of pop into the front of my head when I think about the future.
Yeah, of course. I wish I could say no, but unfortunately, we already live in a state of climate emergencies, as a lot of countries have declared. And especially now that we don't really have gender responsive policies, meaning policies that especially make sure that women and girls stay safe in the event of a catastrophe, for instance. We can already see the effects, because now there are a lot of studies showing how especially climate migrants, who are mostly women, as I was saying, then once they have to migrate, are suffering more from gender-based violence, in particular sexual harassment, because indeed in refugees center there is no, most of the time, specific attention to women and girls and their needs, and then they end up undergoing harassment. And also this connects to the issue of water security and food security as well, actually, because especially for water, in the Global South, most of the people that have to fetch water for their communities are women. And of course, with global warming, there is less and less water, and more places turning into deserts, which means that women and girls, because it's also girls and young women that have to do this, they have to walk longer and longer in extreme, like, hot weather conditions, or which also increases the likelihood of gender-based violence, because the studies show that then they have to walk path and they have to do different routes that they don't know, and they are alone, and that also makes it so for them that there is more violence. And next to this, for sure, it also increases water insecurity, because as they are responsible for this, and their health is also more impacted by climate change, and they have to walk more, of course, they're going to be less and less able to gather water for their communities. At the same time, there is less water. So it's definitely an unfortunate synergy that we see there. And the same with food, because even though women and girls comprise, I think, 40-50% of farmers in the world, in the Global South, they produce up to 80% of the food. So this is an incredible number that also shows the ecological knowledge that they hold a lot of times. But this also means that with increasing climate emergency, there's going to be more food insecurity because of the effects they already experiences, but also the effects, of course, on the crops and on plantations. And also that now we're trying to focus on monoculture, but it doesn't really match the knowledge of the women, and also the climate crisis, because monoculture is extremely problematic with increasing temperature, because it's way harder than to grow it and you need way more water. So as you can see, it's all connected at the moment, and not really in the best way.
Yeah, no, this is a good segue into I guess another thing that is coming up in my mind when you were mentioning how especially women and girls, especially in the Global South, they have certain cultural norms and societal expectations placed upon them in terms of what they're expected to do, for example, like collecting water. So I guess I just wanted to find out what your thoughts are on how big of a influence are cultural norms and traditions, and how they affect the vulnerabilities, women experience when it comes to climate change. And do you think that, these cultural norms and societal expectations are changing in the Global South, or do you think that they are getting, in a sense, reinforced?
I think it's a very hard question, because we need to be careful with the ways in which we phrase this, because of course on one hand, I agree with you when you say that a lot of times it's cultural norms that makes it so that women and girls are more exposed to the effects of climate change. But at the same time, I think that this issue needs to be put into the context of colonialism and in general neocolonial practices, because a lot of the times in the development world, we, especially in organizations like mine, NGOs, etc., there is this assumption that we need to try to change these norms, etc. But then once you put it in the historical context, you realize that actually it was Europe and the US that really shaped these social norms, and that they actually come from more Western societies. So, of course, it's important to look at the social roles that women and girls take. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because to truly move forward these roles, I think we need to think bigger than just about the specific division of work and labor that we also look at so much in the West, like this dualism between women doing care and men doing work. For sure, that's still very big in the Global South, but also in the Global North. So it is through theories like degrowth and decolonialism and intersectionality that I think that you can start dismantling all of this, whilst putting it in a historical context, because then at the same time, these career roles sometimes do allow us to see also an indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge that women and girls can also have when it comes to preserving natural resources and in general as they call like ecosystem services. And we cannot deny that women have been overburdened with the unpaid and undervalued care of humans and ecosystem. But this was done in order indeed to sustain the idea of continuous capitalist growth. So that's also connected.
Do you think that in the context of all this, and especially of the things that you've mentioned, do you think that, for example, urbanization and higher levels of education and income, just for take 3 examples, do you think that they are helping?
I think it really depends on the contexts. You mentioned urbanization and higher incomes, right? No, I think it really depends, because even in Europe, where of course studies are showing that like incomes are like rising, and also for women and girls, and that of course urbanization is like a very big thing at the moment. I mean, everywhere in the world, but especially in Europe, where people are increasingly moving to cities also for higher incomes. There is still the evidence that then women and girls tend, and this is for Europe, but women and girls then tend to do still double the work of men, because at work they need to prove themselves more most of the time, and then when they go home, of course, if they are in a traditional family structure, they tend to have to still take care of domestic and reproductive responsibilities, which makes it so that they are still more affected than men when it comes to workload. So I do think that for sure urbanization and higher pay helps, because it allows to focus on other things and to be less dependent also on natural resources perhaps. But at the same time, I don't think it's enough simply on its own.
I guess we've been kind of focusing quite a lot on the impacts associated with, for example, with climate change on women. And I do want to, I guess, shift into a bit more of a solutions-focused area where women can play a bigger role in, for example, like adaptation and mitigation to climate change. So I guess from your perspective, how important is the view and opinion of women when we're talking about solutions to climate change? How does, say, a gendered viewpoint affect any sort of climate policy, for example?
I think it's a great question, and that we need to have these conversations way more, because in general, we tend to focus on this narrative of women and girls as vulnerable victims, but actually that is not the case. So I love this question. Thank you. So also my specific project indeed really answers this question, because I work for something that is called the Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards. So through the program, we really focus on the solutions that are currently implemented by women, especially in global south countries, and especially by women leaders in their local communities. So I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of them. And what my experience shows, and also a lot of research, is that women and girls tend to have more ecological knowledge, but also pre-colonial thoughts. And with this, to explain for the listeners, it refers to more ancestral and intergenerational indigenous knowledge about the land, but also about connecting and also about bigger theories such as also Ubuntu in Africa, Buen Vivir, so like well-being in Latin America, and how a lot of the times it's the women and girls that tend to preserve this knowledge generation to generation. And if there is something that I think I have seen in my work, especially with the Gender Just Climate Solutions, is that women-led initiatives around the world are making one thing clear, that ensuring a safe, clean, healthy environment requires us to integrate different forms of knowledge, and while fostering respect for culture, spiritual identity, and then eliminating multiple forms of oppression. That is something that I think has been really great in my work, and to focus on that and the amazing solutions that are already there indeed, because I think that women and girls have been working also on these things for decades, but we're still focusing on everything that is going there. But actually, these solutions are already changing the narrative at the local level, and they are already changing things from the bottom up, which I think is really inspiring and hopeful, and what we need to focus more on right now.
And if we do look at the state of the world today and in terms of climate solutions and negotiations, what kind of, I guess you've just mentioned part of a lot of the good that can come out of taking a viewpoint from a female's perspective. And I think the latest example that comes to my mind in terms of barriers of what is still hindering this, I guess, viewpoint, a gendered viewpoint is for example, and I'm sure you've seen this at the COP29 climate conference committee, that was fully made up of men, and then obviously they changed that after a bit of backlash. And I guess this kind of spoke to me in the way of there are still barriers at the, I guess, the highest level of where we're negotiating on how we come up with solutions on climate change. I was just wondering how you think about the current challenges to more inclusion of women and their viewpoints in terms of coming up with solutions to climate change.
It's very hard at the moment, and it doesn't show to be getting any better, because as you were saying, with the committee of COP29, it was a scandal. And even now, the women that have been put in the board, which is still, I think, 10% of the committee or something like that. I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but it's still a very small part of it. It's not women that have worked in climate, but more like the people that already work for the men that are part of the committee, which is something that a lot of times we tend to see in these spaces, that we demand for more gender inclusion, but then they do it and to a very small extent, and then they don't include like women that have worked on this for so long, or like roles that are more meaningful in that way. And also I attended COP28, and also there was this shocking photo of like when all the presidents from all over the world came for the World Action Summit, and there were only like 5 women in that picture out of, I think, around 100 like leaders in the world, which really shows that the problem is institutional. Because of course the photo is shocking, but also not at the same time, because of course we're still most of the presidents in the world are still men, but it shows how international the problem is and how it connects to all these bigger systems that I've talked about, like the patriarchy and colonialism and all these notions that affect things very high level, but also very low level as well, because it's things that I think most women and girls here experience on a day-to-day basis everywhere in the world, no matter like go south, go north. Everyone still has to go through gender discrimination, and not to mention, if you then look at it in an intersectional way, how then there are like more specific categories of women, like for instance, like women that tend to be even more hit by climate change and be even less, that they can join these climate committees even less. Because a lot of times in these spaces, even in feminist environmental spaces, we do see an increasing number of women, which is hopeful, but then it's still a lot of cis white women, which is still not making the conversation inclusive, because it's still allowing the more privileged to go there instead of the ones that indeed are implementing these solutions on the local ground that have often the hardest barriers to overcome because of a lot of factors, of course, but even language is a big one, and how these international spaces are all in English, that makes it super inaccessible for most of the world that did not have access to like a higher education where English was like involved. But this is only one example, but there are many, many more that, again, I could talk about for hours.
And on that note, Gaia, I just wanted to, I am mindful of your time, and it has been wonderful to speak to you. And I just had one final question that I'd like to get your thoughts on, and just to finish up and close the conversation is what would you like to see happen in of course the short term and the long term when it comes to climate change and women specifically? What are some things that you would like to see happen now and in the future?
No, wonderful question for sure. Well, connecting to everything that we've said, I do think we need to keep uplifting women's voices, and especially listen to the ones that we don't see in the mainstream environmentalist discourses, and at the same time try to keep an intersectional approach. But to be more specific, what I would really love to see is, for instance, more climate finance going into women-led climate solutions, because now it's really hard to for small women-led organizations to ask for funding because of all the barriers that we've talked about. And I would really like to see more feminist finance going into that, so that they can scale up their solutions and inspire others. And at the same time, for that, of course, they need all of our support and all the visibility we can give them. So I'm really happy even to have had this space to talk about some of their work. And I think that that's already a great start, in my opinion.
Well, Gaia, thank you so much for your time. And before you go, could you please point listeners to where they could either follow your work or, for example, your organization's work, maybe on social media?
Yes, of course. So my organization is called WECF, Women Engaged for a Common Future. You can follow us on Instagram by looking up the name, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and Twitter. But we also have a website where you can visit us and reach out to us via email if you have any more questions, or if you're more curious to hear about our work, or to hear especially about the gender just climate solutions.
Well, thank you so much, Gaia. It was really wonderful to speak to you. If you found this episode of Attributions valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channel, follow us on social media, share it with your friends and with your network, and visit our website at www.climateimpactstracker.com for articles and more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you again on the next episode of Attributions.